The fluorescent lights in my father's study had never been turned off. Not once, in all the years I'd lived in that house. I used to think it was just his way of reminding everyone that the work never stopped, that the clock never stopped, that the Whitfield name never slept. It was a Thursday evening in November when I walked into that room and told him I was leaving the firm. He didn't look up from his desk. He was reviewing a client portfolio, a thick stack of papers spread across the mahogany surface, a half-eaten sandwich pushed to the corner, forgotten. He had this way of making you feel like an interruption even when you'd been invited. Like your presence was a footnote in a much more important document. "Dad," I said, "I need to talk to you." He turned a page. "I'm leaving Whitfield Financial. I'm not coming back in January. I'm going to pursue design full-time." The page turning stopped. Have you ever said something out loud that you'd been rehearsing for years, and the moment it leaves your mouth, you realize you've been terrified of it your whole life? Tell me if that's ever happened to you. Down in the comments. I want to hear it. He finally looked up. His reading glasses were low on his nose. He had the same expression he used when a client had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Not angry, worse. Disappointed in a clinical, detached way. The way a doctor looks at a terminal chart. "Design," he repeated. He said it the way someone says a word in a foreign language they don't respect. "Sustainable fashion," I said. "I've been building a brand for 2 years. It's gaining traction. I have a real shot at—" "You have a real shot at what, Lauren?" He set his pen down. "You have a degree from Wharton. You have a position at one of the oldest wealth management firms in Connecticut, a position that I built for you, that I have spent 30 years building for you." "I know," I said, "and I'm grateful, but it's not." He stood up. And when my father stood up, the room got smaller. He was 6'2" and 61 years old, and he had the posture of a man who had never once slouched. "Your grandmother came to this country with $40 and a suitcase," he said. "I built this firm from nothing. I gave you a foundation that most people spend their entire lives trying to reach. And you want to throw it away to sew clothes. It's not just clothes, Dad. It's—" "Get out of my office," he said. His voice was quiet. That was always the worst sign. The quieter he got, the more dangerous it was. "Get out and do not come back until you've come to your senses. And if you walk out of this firm, Lauren, don't expect this family to catch you when you fall." My mother was standing in the hallway when I came out. She'd heard everything through the door. She always heard everything through the door, and she always pretended she hadn't. She looked at me with this small, tight expression that I had seen my entire life. It meant, "Please don't make this harder than it already is." It meant, "We don't air things out, we smooth them over." It meant, "What will people say at the club?" "Mom," I started. "Give him time," she said softly. "Just give him time and go back in there and—" "I'm not going back in there," I said. "I love you, but I'm not going back." I went upstairs and I packed 2 suitcases. Not everything, just the things that were mine. My sketchbooks, my fabric samples, my grandmother's old sewing kit that she'd given me when I was 9 years old. The one thing in that house that had ever actually felt like it belonged to me. My older brother Tyler was in his room down the hall. His door was closed. It stayed closed. He didn't come out once. Tyler was the one who had wanted the firm. The one who'd gone into finance because he genuinely loved it, not because our father had mapped out his future before he could walk. Tyler was the golden child, not because he was more loved, but because he was more convenient. He fit the frame. I never did. I loaded my car at 11 at night, in the cold Connecticut dark, and I drove south. I want you to understand something about the next 18 months, because people always skip this part. They want to hear about the success. They don't want to hear about the parking lot of a Waffle House in Virginia where I sat in my car at 2 in the morning and cried so hard I couldn't see the dashboard. They don't want to hear about the sublet in Asheville, North Carolina, where the heat didn't work properly, and I slept in 2 sweaters and told myself every single night that I had not made a terrible mistake. I had chosen Asheville for 3 reasons. It was affordable enough that my savings could stretch. It had a creative community that actually existed, real artists, real makers, real people who understood that building something from scratch was not a phase. And it was far enough from Greenwich that I couldn't hear my father's voice in my sleep. I had started the brand 2 years before I quit the firm, quietly, on weekends and late nights, because I had known for a long time that I was living someone else's life, and I was terrified of what would happen when I finally admitted it. The brand was called Loam. That's it, just loam, like the soil. I made women's clothing using dead-stock fabric material that textile mills and manufacturers would otherwise throw away. Nothing was produced new. Everything was reclaimed, restructured, reimagined. It was sustainable fashion before that phrase became a marketing strategy for fast fashion brands to put on their websites and mean absolutely nothing. I had a small but loyal following online, maybe 4,000 people at the time I moved. Not enough to live on. Not even close. I worked a part-time job at a local alterations shop, hemming dress pants and repairing zippers for $9 an hour, and I thought about the Wharton degree on my wall in Greenwich, and I laughed until it hurt. But the nights were mine. The nights were always mine. I worked in the corner of my tiny apartment on a folding table that I'd found on the side of the road, under a clip lamp, cutting patterns until my fingers cramped. The thing about reclaiming fabric is that it forces you to be creative in a way that starting fresh never requires. You can't just design what you want and then find the material. You have to look at what exists, understand what it's already been, and figure out what it could become. I fell in love with that constraint. It felt like the truth of something. I met a woman named Diane Okafor at a maker's market 6 months after I moved. She was 64 years old, a former textile engineer who had spent 30 years in the industry and retired to Asheville to raise chickens and grow vegetables and generally refused to be involved in anything that wasn't worth her time. She stopped at my table and picked up a jacket I'd made from reclaimed denim and deadstock wool. She turned it inside out. She checked the seams. She looked up at me. "Who taught you construction like this?" "No one," I said. "I taught myself." She put the jacket down. Bought it. Came back the next morning with 2 cups of coffee and a list of contacts. Diane became my mentor. She had relationships with sustainable textile suppliers, with independent boutiques, with buyers at small department stores who were genuinely trying to change the way they sourced. She didn't do things for me. She opened doors and then stepped back and let me walk through them. She was the first person in my adult life who looked at what I was building and said, "This is serious, and you should treat it that way." By month 8 in Asheville, I had 12 wholesale accounts. By month 14, I had 31. I hired my first employee, a recent design school graduate named Priya, who was so talented it occasionally made me want to sit down. We moved out of my apartment and into a small studio space in the River Arts District. We started sleeping actual hours. And then a writer from a sustainability publication called Groundwork reached out and asked if she could do a piece on loam. The article published on a Tuesday in March. By Thursday, our website had crashed 3 times. Our inbox had over 600 messages. A boutique in Tokyo wanted to carry us. A stylist in London reached out about dressing a client for an awards ceremony. I sat on the floor of the studio and read the emails out loud to Priya, and we looked at each other like 2 people who had just survived something. Neither of us fully understood yet. That was the beginning of the 2nd chapter. Over the next year, loam grew in a way that I could not have engineered if I'd tried. I want to be honest about that because I think there is a lie that gets told about success, that it's purely the result of vision and hard work and refusing to give up. Those things matter. They mattered enormously. But there was also luck. There was also timing. The conversation about fast fashion and its environmental damage was finally reaching mainstream consumers, and loam existed at exactly the intersection of beautiful clothing and genuine accountability. We were not the only brand doing this, but we were doing it in a way that resonated. I also want to tell you about the taxes, because I've noticed that no one ever talks about this part and then people in the comments act shocked. When you build a business and it earns real money, you pay real taxes, a significant portion. I had a very good accountant Diane had recommended her, and we were meticulous. Every decision I made financially was made with that reality in front of me. I say this because what comes next involves numbers, and I want you to understand that the numbers I'm going to tell you are after-tax, net figures, not the top line. In the spring of my 3rd year in Asheville, I received an acquisition offer from a European lifestyle group called Arvid Collective. They were based in Copenhagen. They had acquired 3 other independent sustainable brands in the previous 5 years, and they had a reputation for leaving the creative direction largely intact. They wanted loam. Not just the inventory, not just the wholesale contracts, the brand, the methodology, the supply chain relationships, and me on a 3-year creative director contract. After 4 months of negotiations, and after my lawyer had gone through every line of that contract more times than I can count, we closed at $8 million. $8 million, after everything. After taxes, after legal fees, after I paid Priya a bonus that made her cry in the parking lot. $8 million. I didn't pop champagne. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the studio, and I called Diane, and she said, "Well, what are you going to do with it?" And I said, "I think I want to buy a house." And she said, "Buy something that makes you feel like yourself." And I said, "I will." I bought a property outside of Asheville, not in the city. About 20 minutes outside, in the mountains. It was a restored farmhouse on 11 acres with a view of the Blue Ridge that on clear mornings looks like something a person painted and then stepped into. I paid $2.4 million for it. in cash. I kept the remaining funds invested and working because I had a Wharton degree, and I knew how to do that, even if my father had never believed I did. The house had a barn on the property that I converted into a studio. The studio had skylights and a concrete floor and walls wide enough to hang fabric samples 12 feet long. I filled it slowly and deliberately, and for the first time in my life, the space I lived and worked in felt like it had been built for a person who actually existed. I lived quietly for a few months, worked on the Arvid transition, took long walks on the property, had Diane over for dinner on Sundays, let myself be still. I had not spoken to my father or my mother or my brother Tyler since the night I left. Not one word. Not a text. Not a birthday message. 18 months of silence from a family that had watched me pack my car and said nothing. I had thought about reaching out. In the early months, in the hard months, when the heat wasn't working and the savings were shrinking. I thought about it the way you think about a door you know you shouldn't open. Not because you don't want what's behind it, but because you know what's behind it, and it isn't what you need. They didn't reach out either. Not once. I checked, sometimes. I'm human. I checked. And then a magazine called Ember. It covers design, craft, and independent business. The kind of publication that sits on the coffee tables of people who actually care about what they're buying ran a feature story on the Loam acquisition. It was a long piece, well written, and it included photographs of the farmhouse, the studio, the view from the barn. The reporter had interviewed Diane and Priya and the Arvid team. It was a very flattering, very detailed, very public account of exactly where I was and exactly what I had built. It published on a Friday. My phone rang on Sunday morning. An unknown number, Connecticut area code. I stared at it for a full 4 rings before I answered. Lauren. It was my brother Tyler. His voice had that particular texture I remembered from client dinners, smooth, measured, warm in a way that wasn't quite warm. Hey, it's been a long time. It has, I said. What do you want, Tyler? He laughed, like I'd said something endearing. Can't a brother call his sister just to say hello? You didn't call for 18 months, I said. So, no. What is it? A pause. The kind of pause that means someone is deciding how to say a thing they've already decided to say. We saw the article. Mo and Dad and I. And Lauren, we're so proud of you. We always believed in you. You know that. And we were thinking it's been too long, we want to come visit. Come see this house. See what you've built. Dad wants to come. Dad wants to come. I held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the mountains. There was frost on the grass. The sky was that specific blue that only happens in the mountains in early winter, clear and cold and so sharp it almost hurts to look at. Something happened to me in that moment that I had not expected. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I felt a kind of cold, precise clarity, like a lens coming into focus. I knew exactly what this was. I had known since the first ring of that phone. They hadn't called when I left. They hadn't called when I was sleeping in 2 sweaters and hemming dress pants for $9 an hour. They hadn't called on my birthday, or at Christmas, or on any of the days when a simple text saying, "Are you alive?" would have meant something. But the Ember article had photographs of an 11-acre mountain property, and now Tyler was calling to say they'd always believed in me. Fine, I said. Next weekend. I heard the relief in his voice before he covered it. Great. That's great, Lauren. We'll see you Saturday. I hung up and sat with it for a long moment. Then I called Diane. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was her way. When I finished, she said, "Do you know what you're going to do?" Yes, I said. I think I've known for a long time. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, the 3 of them, in a rental car that my father had probably insisted on upgrading at the counter because he always upgraded at the counter. My mother stepped out first, in a camel coat and her good pearls, looking around at the mountains with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected and isn't sure if they're supposed to be impressed or alarmed. My brother Tyler came around too, from the passenger side, hands in his coat pockets, smiling his fundraiser smile. And then my father got out of the driver's seat. He was thinner than I remembered. Something about his face was different. I noted it, filed it, held it at a distance. I met them on the front porch. My mother reached for me first, a hug that was more of a gesture in the shape of a hug, her arms around me for a second, her cheek near mine but not quite touching. Lauren, look at this place. Come inside, I said. I gave them the tour. I watched them see it, the high ceilings, the reclaimed wood floors, the studio visible through the barn window, the mountain view from the back of the house that stopped my mother mid-sentence. My brother walked slowly through each room with the careful attention of someone calculating. My father said very little. He looked at the structure, the land, the scale of things. "This is what you make," he said in the studio, standing in front of a rack of samples. "This is what we make," I said. Loam. He looked at a coat, a long, structured coat in reclaimed gray wool that Priya had cut and I had finished, and that I considered one of the best things we had ever produced. He touched the sleeve. His face was unreadable. We had lunch at the long kitchen table. I had cooked, because it was my house, and I did things my way. The food was good. My mother said so, twice, in the way she gave compliments factually, with slight surprise, as though goodness was always a little unexpected. The conversation was careful. My mother asked about the town, about the neighbors, about whether winter in the mountains was very hard. Tyler asked about the Arvid deal, in the tone of someone asking about a stock they should have bought. My father ate and said almost nothing. And then, after I cleared the plates, after the table was quiet, he set both hands flat on the wood and looked at me directly, for the first time all day. Lauren, I'll be straight with you. Here it is, I thought. The firm has had a difficult 2 years. He didn't flinch when he said it, I'll give him that. He'd always had a certain cold courage about stating bad facts. We lost 3 major clients after the market volatility. Tyler's division took losses. I've managed it, but I've had to draw down significantly. I'm not in a position to carry the overhead through another year without a capital infusion. My mother looked at the table. Tyler stared at his water glass. My father continued, given your current position, given the liquidity from the sale, I thought you might consider an investment in the firm, a partnership stake. It would help stabilize our situation, and ultimately it would be an asset for you, a connection back to your family's legacy. There it was. The whole structure of it, assembled and presented like a prospectus. Not I'm sorry, not I was wrong about you, not I should have called. An investment opportunity, a partnership stake, a connection back to your family's legacy. The family that had not called in 18 months. The family whose legacy I had been invited to leave when I was standing in a cold hallway with 2 suitcases. I sat with it for a moment. I let the words sit there on the table between us where everyone could see them clearly. I want to ask you something, I said, and I want you to actually answer it. My father waited. When I left, I said, I was 28 years old. I had $10,000 in savings. I didn't have a place to live. I didn't have a salary or a safety net. I was starting completely from nothing. You knew all of that. You all knew it, and not one of you called. Not one of you sent a single message to check if I was okay. 18 months. Not once. My mother opened her mouth. I'm not finished, I said. My voice was steady. I was not angry. That surprised me. Even then, I wasn't angry. I was just clear. Dad, I said, you are a good businessman. You know how to read a room. You know the difference between genuine interest and strategic positioning. So, I want you to think very carefully about what it looks like that the first contact this family has made with me in a year and a half came 48 hours after a magazine printed photographs of this property. My father's jaw tightened. That is exactly what it is, I said. I'm not angry about it. I want you to understand that. I'm not sitting here hurt and looking for an apology. I'm sitting here looking at 3 people who love a version of me that performs correctly for them, and who have no idea what to do with the version that doesn't. Tyler shifted in his chair. Dad, you couldn't call me for a year and a half because I had failed your expectations. I understand that. I grew up in that house. I understand how you think. But I want you to hear me say this clearly. The reason you can't fund your own firm right now is not my responsibility to fix. You made those decisions. Those are your losses. And the fact that you have a daughter who has resources you didn't plan for does not make those resources yours to draw on. My mother's eyes were wet. She was twisting the stem of her water glass. I spent 28 years trying to earn approval in a house where the approval was never actually available, I said. I looked at each of them, my mother, my brother, my father. There's a word for that. I've had a lot of time to think about it. It's called a transactional relationship. The love is always conditional. It's always performing. It's always a return on investment. And what I realized, when I was living in a drafty apartment in Asheville and sewing samples on a folding table at midnight, is that I was exhausted. Not from the work, from the performing. I was so tired of auditioning for people who had already decided I didn't fit the part. My father's face had gone still. It was a different kind of still than his usual distance. Something in it looked like a man hearing a thing he'd been hoping not to hear for a very long time. I looked at him and I said something I had not planned to say, but that came out of me as clearly as anything I have ever said. I know you're scared right now. I know the firm is in trouble and you don't know how to ask for help without framing it as a transaction because that's the only language you've ever learned. And I'm sorry for that. I'm genuinely sorry that you built a life that taught you love has to be earned. But I am not going to fund the firm. I am not going to do that. Not because I don't love you, I do, I think, in whatever complicated way. We love people who've hurt us, but because saying yes would mean going back to being what you needed me to be instead of what I actually am. And I can't do that again. I won't. The room was quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains were going blue in the afternoon shadow. The guest rooms are made up, I said. You're welcome to stay tonight, and I mean that genuinely. But I think we all need some space right now. My father stood. He was still tall, still straight-backed, but something in the room had shifted in a way that I didn't think could shift back. He nodded once. In the way he acknowledged things he had no counter-argument for. My mother gathered herself quietly. Tyler looked at his hands. They stayed the night. I cooked dinner. We talked about small things, the mountains, the town, a restaurant my mother had read about in the area. It was the strangest evening I can remember, this family of mine, sitting around a table in a house that didn't belong to the life they'd planned for me, eating food I had cooked, not talking about any of the things that had just been said, and also not pretending they hadn't been said. Something had been put on the table, seen clearly, and left there. It wasn't resolved. I don't know if it will be, but it was honest, maybe for the first time. They drove back to the airport the next morning. My mother hugged me at the door, a real hug this time, longer than the first one. She didn't say anything. Sometimes that's the most honest thing a person can offer. I watched the rental car go down the driveway and disappear around the tree line, and then I turned back to my house. That was 4 months ago. Diane comes by on Sunday evenings and we cook together and argue about textiles, and she tells me stories about the industry that I'm not sure are entirely true, but are always worth hearing. Priya and I are deep in the next loam collection, the first one fully under the Arvid umbrella, and it is the best work we have done. 3 months ago, I started a small program 8 hours a week in the studio for young women from the county's workforce development program who want to learn garment construction. There are 6 of them right now. 2 of them are extraordinarily talented. One of them, a 20-year-old named Carmen, who commutes 40 minutes each way, reminds me so much of who I was at that age that it sometimes takes my breath away. She has her grandmother's sewing kit in her bag every single time she comes in. I think about what my father built. I think about it often, actually, without bitterness. He is a man who learned that value is proven through output, that love is maintained through performance, and that legacy is something you construct and defend. He is not a villain. He is a person shaped by a story I don't fully know, doing the only things he knew how to do with the tools he was given. I can hold that truth and still say, I will not repeat it. What I am building here is not a monument. It's not a legacy in the way my father meant that word. It's something smaller and more stubborn and more alive. It's 11 acres and a barn full of light, and reclaimed fabric, and a folding table that I kept, actually, even after I could have replaced it with anything. I kept it because I made something real on that table. And I want to remember what real feels like when you start from nothing. My name is Lauren Whitfield. My father told me to get out and I did, and what I found on the other side of that door was the only life that has ever actually felt like mine. What did you have to walk away from before you could walk toward what you actually wanted? I read every single comment. Tell me your story. And if this one meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you next time on Karma's Tangle.